Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for having me. And I'll really kind of ride the coattails here of Dr. Graber to talk a little bit more about clinical challenges that we face as neurosurgeons, and really focus on the benefit of multidisciplinary care. So I have no disclosures for this talk. So I'm primarily a skull-based surgeon, and throughout my training and the early years of my career, I've really fallen in love with endoscopic surgery and really see a benefit of it more so than just the classic pathologies that we think that it should be used for, things like pituitary adenomas, Rathke's cleft cysts, midline meningiomas. And I think there's a real benefit to collaborating with our ENT colleagues and using the endoscope as a tool to access different areas of the skull base, both intracranial and extracranial. And so as a historical perspective, the first endoscopic endonasal approach was performed in the 1960s. And advancements in the techniques was really limited by the technology. And so within the 1970s and 1980s, endoscopes were primarily used as an adjunct for traditional microsurgical approaches. But by the 1990s, the imaging technology markedly improved, and we started to see improvements and a vastly increased usage of the endoscope for pituitary lesions. And within the 2000s and really to today, we've seen a refinement of these approaches and really pushing the boundaries of what's possible using the endoscope. And that moves beyond our midline cellar approach. Now folks are starting to explore the cavernous sinus, use it for extended approaches to go lateral to the carotid artery and access all three different cranial fossa. And what I found in my early career is that the willingness to partner with colleagues in ENT and elsewhere is that we're able to push that boundary now and address pathology that I hadn't seen in my training. And I think that's because when you're within a group of like-minded people that are hoping to push the boundaries of what you can use the endoscope for, I think we start to see good results from that. And so, as a neurosurgeon, and I think many of the neurosurgeons in this room would agree, the outcomes that we typically think of for skull-based surgery are your extent of resection, your postoperative CSF leak rates, hopefully very, very low rates of carotid artery injury, hypopituitarism, and vision outcomes. And I think endoscopic surgery today should really expand on that to look at patient quality of life outcomes. So we can measure those prospectively using the sinonasal outcome test and the skull base inventory. And what we found in looking at our patients at this is that a lot of patients really do struggle with the postoperative sinonasal morbidity. And so that affords us the ability to work with our ENT colleagues to make sure that we're being very mindful of our operative corridors, our dissection corridors, to make sure that we're not only thinking of extent of resection, but also the patient's quality of life afterwards. And that really leads us to the importance of clinical partnership. And I just show this slide to show the vast number of folks that are integrally important for our skull-based efforts over at the University of Washington here on the left, and then at Seattle Children's Hospital on the right. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's here to show that we can't operate in a silo. For the best results, we need all of us to look at the same pathology through our unique lenses and come together to make sure we have the best possible outcomes. So I don't think it should come as any surprise about the importance of clinical partnership to optimize our oncologic and quality of life outcomes. For those of us that are pretty facile with the standard direct endoscopic endonasal approach, having two surgeons there affords a four-hand technique that's different from just a single surgeon. When I work with my partners, my ENT colleagues, and are able to direct the endoscope while I can use binary access, one hand using a sucker, one hand using a dissector, to have that two-handed dissection technique similar to what we would use for open surgery. Similarly, with an ENT approach, you get expansive exposure while maintaining olfaction and preventing postoperative sinonasal morbidity. There's so many nuances to endoscopic endonasal surgery that I think folks really benefit when you get essentially a sinus surgery alongside your adenoma resection. And finally, the ability to work collaboratively to perform not just the approach, the tumor resection, but also your reconstruction really affords pushing the boundaries of what's possible with an endoscopic approach. And I'll show cases here that I don't think are possible without that multidisciplinary approach, unique pedicled flaps, free mucosal flaps that's afforded by this collaboration. And so to kind of move beyond just our standard midline approach for a non-functional or functional pituitary adenoma, we're starting to see expansion laterally into the cavernous sinus. And this has really been shown over the last 5 to 8 years or so. So this was a recent patient of mine. It was a 16-year-old with ACTH-dependent Cushing's disease. You can see his preoperative MRI there on the left. And the top endoscopic image here, I think would kind of be a common resection for an MRI like this, where you have a midline approach. You've resected a very clear tumor on the right side of the sella. But starting to push things a little further, knowing that there's real ample evidence for resection of the medial cavernous sinus wall, and doing it in an anatomic way to make sure that you resect the entire wall, really, I think, improves the rates of biochemical remission. And I don't think this is really possible to do without multidisciplinary collaboration to make sure that you have optimal visualization and an optimal approach. And when you're doing expanded approaches like this, you're probably a little higher risk of CSF leak, and so being able to address that in a safe way. And so the bottom image here shows the medial cavernous sinus wall being dissected, and finally on the right side, postoperative image showing the resection cavity of where the tumor once was, and then also the exposed cavernous sinus with the medial cavernous sinus wall being removed. This patient did really well. His cortisol natored at 0.8 after surgery, and we're currently working on tapering his steroids. But I think very high chance of biochemical cure here. And similar to working in the lateral plane, working well beyond the parasagittal region and into the ventricular system, I think this is possible now because primarily of the reconstructive techniques that are afforded by our multidisciplinary collaboration. And so I have 2 patients here, and this just goes to show that we can perform these surgeries safely in older folks and very young children as well. And so the top row, this was a 66-year-old man that presented with what we suspected to be a craniopharyngioma. The middle slide here shows the post-resection endoscopic view, where you can appreciate the pituitary gland, a maintained infundibulum, and then looking into the third ventricle. So this patient, by definition, would have a high-flow CSF leak needing multi-layer reconstruction, and this patient did great with no evidence of postoperative CSF leak. And similarly, on the bottom row, this was the images of a 2-year-old with a craniopharyngioma. And I think in many places, this would be treated with a biopsy with radiation to follow. And I'm certainly not saying that's the wrong approach. I'm saying it's a different approach. And in our eyes, we counseled the family on potentially delaying the need for radiation to allow this child to more further develop, further develop over time. And, if he never needs it, that's great. But if he does, maybe we delayed things by at least a few years with this operation. And again, you can see this craniopharyngioma in the sagittal plane here. This was the intraoperative image showing the final bits of tumor resection with the diaphragm herniating down, and finally the postoperative images. And so moving beyond the midline plane of the skull base, I think has been a really great part of my career over the past year and a half. This is a case that I think these next couple cases, I think really, showcase the benefit of multidisciplinary collaboration, because there is a role for the skull-based neurosurgeon beyond just the sella. So this was a patient that had presented with near blindness. You can see a lesion in the right optic canal there. And these intraoperative images, I'll just kind of tell you the lay of the land. This is the right orbit that's been decompressed. The lamina has been removed. You can see a full optic nerve or optic canal decompression with the dura within the optic canal shown. And we opened that dura and we were able to dissect free what ended up being a cavernous hemangioma within the optic canal. You can just see the optic nerve up here. And on the postoperative scan, you can see that decompression. We're still waiting our postoperative MRI, but functionally the patient's doing really well. He initially presented with 2400 vision and within 2 days of surgery was able to start reading text from across the room. And similarly, we don't always have to work through the nose, but we can use the endoscope through different keyhole style approaches. And this was a great paper for those of you who are interested that really showed the learning curve of transorbital surgery. And I think they're spot on, because this is something that I'm still working through and hopefully becoming an expert in. And we performed this in about a half dozen patients across town at the university for varying pathologies. And I find it to be an incredibly helpful tool in very, very select patients. And so this was a 64-year-old woman who initially had presented years ago. I had operated on her as a resident, and she had a grade 3 meningioma. She had undergone innumerable operations, radiation, complicated, unfortunately, by infection at one point, requiring a cranioplasty and ultimately free flap soft tissue reconstruction. And she had presented with increasing tension pneumocephalus. And when you looked at her previous surgical site, I don't think a single surgeon would have felt comfortable opening that up. But on the middle image here, you can see that there's a small defect in the frontal sinus that I think had eroded over time due to potentially chronic osteomyelitis. And so we approached this via tones to access the frontal sinus and plug that defect with a small piece of fat and then a free mucosal graft. And postoperative imaging a year later showed that tension pneumocephalus had completely resolved, and we were able to keep the previous surgical site uninterrupted, which I think was a real benefit for the patient. Similarly, we can address lesions of the sphenoid wing. This is a very, very recent patient that we were able to access via a lateral transorbital approach, fully endoscopic. I think no one would be faulted for approaching this via craniotomy, but we felt that we could access this in a very safe way via transorbital, and we were able to achieve a complete resection, and we're still waiting the path of this. I suspect that this may be related to a radiation-induced neoplasm from prior treatment, and this patient was able to leave the hospital the day after surgery without any ophthalmologic issues. And just moving over to using the endoscope as a multi-portal tool. These are a couple cases over from Seattle Children's Hospital of juvenile nasopharyngeal angiofibroma, which for most of you, if you recall, are just incredibly hemorrhagic lesions. Very classically treated by otolaryngologists, but with our partnership over at Seattle Children's, we've started to do these cases together and started to do them via multiportal approaches. And so with these approaches, all these patients underwent preoperative embolization, which greatly helped any intraoperative blood loss, but we approach this via a multiportal strategy, both endonasal and transmaxillary. And you can see by the arrows on the screen gave us fantastic access to both lateral components of the tumor to have early access to the feeding pedicle. And in these 5 patients, we were able to achieve a complete resection in 4 of them. And I think even more meaningful was that 4 out of the 5 patients didn't require a single transfusion intra-op or post-op, which I think speaks to the benefit of this multi-portal strategy. And similarly, we can combine them, not just transmaxillary and endonasal, but we can combine transorbital and endonasal. These were 2 children with growing ossifying fibromas and subsequent ophthalmologic concerns. And so we were able to achieve a complete resection without postoperative CSF leak. All these children left the patient or left the hospital within a couple days and didn't have any ophthalmologic concerns. And then finally, going from combining minimally invasive keyhole approaches to combining a minimally invasive and maximally invasive approach, I think are needed for some patients. And this is a recent patient that had previously undergone a subtotal endoscopic endonasal resection of a squamous cell carcinoma. We know that the patient had positive margins after the initial operation, and there was subsequent growth without any adjuvant therapy. And so we discussed the care with this patient and were able to offer both a maximal approach via bifrontal and bitemporal craniotomy and combine that with a concurrent endoscopic endonasal approach. And we were able to get everything out, and as you can see on the postoperative imaging here, the entire midline skull base is now missing. And so going back to our multidisciplinary collaborations, we were able to offer a multi-layer reconstruction here with pericranial flaps and pedicle nasoseptal flaps. And this patient's done great, and I think speaks to having the right hammer for the right nail. It's nice to be able to offer minimally invasive keyhole approaches, but when it's necessary, being able to combine those with our more classic bifrontal craniotomies to achieve complete resection of cancers is so important. And so just in conclusion, there's no question that a multidisciplinary approach with like-minded partners allows for personalized surgical care in both adults and children, and that endoscopic approaches should be thought of for lesions well beyond the midline skull base, well beyond the sella and paracellar regions, because our unique skill set as skull base surgeons, I think, affords us the ability to access and treat patients with lesions throughout the skull base. And finally, it's nice to be able to combine endoscopic approaches with our minimally invasive keyhole approaches, as well as our maximally invasive approaches to access different lesions of the skull base. And so with that, thank you, everyone, for your attention. I welcome any questions, and thank you all for your partnership.
All right, Paul, I'll start. Jacob, nice overview and some pretty impressive cases. I'm glad you're enjoying tackling those. One of the things that is sort of the bane of our existence, like you said, is the reconstruction. And so I'm curious your approach for combined cases of restoring the structural and functional separation between the cranial vault and the nasopharyngeal cavity.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think really success hinges on multi-layer reconstruction. So I think you need vascularized flaps. So if you're coming at it from a transcranial approach, making sure to use a vascularized pericranial flap. Before the operation, discussing that plan with your ENT so they know what vascularized flaps might be available to them based on the pathology, whether that's your, classic Cadod flap, or whether that's something that needs to be more creative, or whether you need to bring in a head and neck surgeon to offer a potential free flap, and planning that well ahead of time.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.